Chapter 1. I looked around the room at all the sad, tearful faces present. I wasn't surprised at all by their grief. My husband Dave had been a terrific father, successful businessman, great supporter of our community, and a loyal friend. As a husband, I couldn't have asked for a better man. He'd done his share of the household duties willingly, fully supported my wish to be a stay-at-home parent. Then, in later years, my wish to limit my out-of-house activities to church roles and volunteering. He'd been a far more attentive father to our 3 children, Molly, Derek, and Ann, than most people, and that showed in their successful lives since leaving the nest Dave and I had made for them. Well, Molly and Derek had left. Ann, I was sure, was on the cusp. I looked around at the miserable faces of my children. All of them looked devastated, even my normally reserved Derek. Me? I was still in shock at the suddenness of Dave's passing and struggling to accept that the man I'd loved totally for 32 years had gone to play golf one bright and sunny Saturday morning and had never returned. His lifelong friend and our family solicitor, Jack, who was sitting at the head of the large oak conference table, next to his secretary, had been the one to tell me. Apparently, Dave had driven off the 4th tee, then just collapsed. The results of the medical examination had yet to be made public, but according to Jack, Dave was gone before he hit the ground. They'd performed CPR on him, but by the time the ambulance workers fitted a defibrillator to him, his heart showed no normal rhythm. He was pronounced gone on arrival at the hospital. By the time Jack had managed to track me down, I had my cell phone turned off at the time he'd gotten word to all 3 of our children, and they were all at the hospital before me. That was only 4 days ago, and I think we were all a little stunned still. Jack opened the folder in front of him, took a deep breath, and began to speak. I thank you all for coming today for the reading of the will of the late David Brown, husband, father, and the best friend I ever had. Jack was obviously pretty emotional. Beneath his eyes were dark shadows, and his voice sounded as if his throat was lined with gravel. That must be why his wife, Julie, was in the office that day. She was one of my friends and had been since she met Jack shortly after my wedding. Our relationship had cooled somewhat 10 or so years ago, but I still considered her a friend. I'd seen her hugging her husband in his office as I'd been led to the conference room, where all the children were already seated. In the here and now, I watched as he drew a deep breath and settled himself to become the consummate professional I knew him to be. I know it may seem a departure from standard practice to read the will before the funeral, but, as I will reveal, it was Dave's express wish. I should point out, though, that this is quite unusual, and nothing can be ratified until the full period of probate has expired. Now, to business. He then began reading the actual will. I didn't need to listen. After all, Dave and I'd always updated our wills together. I knew there was a list at the start of specific items Dave wanted individuals to have. Derek, our middle child and only son, was to get Dave's medals from his time in the service with the Army Corps of Engineers, or sappers as Dave liked to call them. That was when he developed his love of explosives. His rock collection was to go to Molly, our eldest, etc. Tuning out, I looked around at the somber expressions on my children's faces. Molly, at just 30, seemed to be taking it all stoically, even though she and her dad had always been close. When I'd come in the room, I'd left her alone as she was looking at the wall with a tear in her eye. I could remember her and Dave talking about those rocks many times. She'd begun a promising career in science until she'd become accidentally pregnant to her boyfriend of about a year. Luckily, he was a nice guy and did the right thing and made an honest woman of her. They'd been married for 5 years now and seemed as happy as ever. 2 beautiful grandchildren for Dave and me to spoil. Derek, at 28, followed in his father's footsteps and was an engineer by day and an Army reservist in his spare time. How long that would last was debatable, though. His wife of 2 years was 8 months pregnant with their first. With his dad as his hero, I'm sure the child will be called David if it's a boy. I'm sad that my Dave won't be around to spoil the first grandchild to share his surname. Derek was staring at Jack. I felt for him. He looked as if he'd aged 5 years in the 4 days since his father's passing. Skin sallow, eyes red-rimmed. Anne, my baby, was officially a mistake. Dave and I had decided 2 children were enough but hadn't been sure enough of that to do something drastic, like getting one of us fixed. Birth control pills had always messed around with my hormones, so we'd relied on condoms. One of them must have failed because 10 years after Derek, Anne made an appearance. Dave got snipped after that. Anne was about to start college, and like the majority of people that age, didn't know yet what she wanted to do. She'd been helping Dave in his demolition business over the summer. She still lived at home, but was spending more and more time at her boyfriend's house, and I knew it was only a matter of time before I had the house to myself. That led me to thoughts about the house I should look at, either downsizing from the 6-bedroom monstrosity or hiring a housekeeper and gardener to help me out. With the contents of our bank account and Dave's life insurance policy, I knew I'd be comfortable for the rest of my life. I half-tuned back into Jack's voice. As we'd agreed, Dave was leaving his Mustang to Anne and his trusty old Jeep to Derek. The business would be turned over to a trust, administered by the children, with the 3 of them acting as the board with equal voting rights. Derek could manage it if he so chose for a generous salary. That was fair. I knew nothing about business and wouldn't need the income. I tuned out again as more details on running the business were read out. Fond thoughts of Dave and my life together were helping me get through the shock of his loss. He was a remarkable man, dragging himself from a difficult upbringing and creating assets from scratch that meant we survivors would want for little in our lives. Suddenly, my third ear picked up a little discord in Jack's words. "I'm sorry, what was that last bit?" Jack with a look of annoyance. Jack turned the page he was reading back over and started rereading the paragraph I'd missed. "The house is to be sold with all profits going into a trust to be administered by Jack Purcell, to be used solely at his discretion for the education of my grandchildren from Molly White, Nee Brown, Derek Brown, and Anne Brown. To this trust will be added the entire contents of my private bank accounts, with said Jack Purcell having my power of attorney to access those accounts. He is also authorized and directed to cancel all credit cards held in my name." My mind was reeling at this point. We'd gone well off the script of the will that Dave and I had updated in this very office not 2 years ago. What the heck was going on? Had Dave secretly changed his will from what I knew about? And as per the nomination of beneficiaries form, lodged with the insurance company, the entirety of my death benefit is to be paid to Ms. Jennifer Sarah Jardine of 12 Pedley Court, Summertown. Suddenly, I was on my feet, having made no conscious decision to rise. My body was on autopilot. Bank accounts emptied, house to be sold, insurance payout to. Who? My husband's PA? I think I yelled something like, "What the heck?" A deathly hush suffused the room. The tension was palpable. I stared at the familiar face of Jack. He stared right back, a look of disgust on his face. I recoiled. To avoid that look, I glanced to his right, straight into the eyes of his secretary. I didn't know her at all. She was new since I'd last been here. The look of contempt on the face of this stranger was possibly even worse than Jack's expression. Turning my face away from both of them forced me to look at my children. Anne and Molly were looking expressionlessly at the table. Even their postures mirrored each other, heads bent, shoulders tense, hands clasped in laps, knuckles white. Derek was the only one looking at me. Looking was the wrong word. He was glaring at me, and with such a depth of anger it made me wish with all my heart he too was looking at the table. Suddenly, a cold thought entered my head. Surely they didn't know. In my last lucid moments before emotions ruled supreme, logic supplied the answers that wishful thinking was suppressing. Dave had known. He'd told Jack and amended the will. Now the icy reception I'd received when I entered this torture chamber made perfect sense. Jack must have given my children a heads up before I arrived. Call me a coward if you like, but I turned and bolted from the room. Julie was still in the office, sitting at the reception desk, on the phone. A rush of relief flooded my roiling stomach. Boy, did I need a friend right now. I walked around the desk to her. I was but 2 paces away when her words penetrated my overheated brain. "If you check your records, you'll see that his wife's cell phone was on a contract under his name. He is deceased now, but if you give me your fax number, I can send you the power of attorney my husband was given over all his affairs." I couldn't believe what I was seeing as she quickly wrote down a number on the legal pad in front of her. She didn't even acknowledge my presence as she thanked the person on the other end of the phone call and hung up. Once she put the phone down, she stood up and placed the chair between us. The look of disgust on her face was heartbreaking. "Jack showed me some of the photos Dave left for your children in a sealed envelope. It's awful. I can't believe you would do such a thing. I hope the time you spent with your young friends was worth ruining the reputation of a truly great man." With that, she walked into the conference room. I stood frozen in shock as she made her way around the large table and embraced her husband. He seemed to be trembling. No one paid any attention to me. No one cared about how devastated I felt. Overwhelmed with loneliness, I ran away. Once outside, I heard a notification sound indicating that I had received a text message. It was from Jack, and it said that Dave had explicitly requested that I not attend his funeral. Chapter 2. I have no idea how I managed to make it home without completely falling apart. I sat on the couch, absolutely stunned. I always believed that Dave loved me with all his heart. True, our intimate life had dwindled over the past 10 years or so until it reached nothing at all. But let's be honest, neither of us were young anymore, and after being together for 32 years, it was natural for passion to fade, right? Oh my goodness, was it about 10 years ago? Maybe even 11? The words Julie spoke to me only an hour ago echoed in my mind. I hope the time you spent with your young friends was worth ruining the reputation of a truly great man. Friends. More than one. Oh my God. Dave must have known about Justin and even Mario. No, that couldn't be possible. Mario was a long time ago. There was no way Dave could have kept quiet about it for so many years. He must have only known about Justin, and Julie must have made a mistake in the heat of the moment. Yes, that's it. However, even that knowledge had driven Dave to cut me out of his will and, worse, to tell our children. What could make him hate me so much? It was all too much. I grabbed the bottle of gin and poured myself a drink in a highball glass. I spilled some of it because my hands were shaking so violently. The burning sensation in my throat provided some minor relief. How could Dave do this to me? I still loved him deeply. Did he even know that? Did he distance himself from me in the past year because he thought I was going to abandon him? Looking back now, I realized that he had become emotionally colder over the last year or so, but I was too preoccupied to connect the dots. I had subconsciously convinced myself that it was due to his own embarrassment about his difficulties. Tears welled up in my eyes once again, threatening to overflow. I blinked them away. I needed to collect my thoughts. I wondered how Dave managed to live with someone like me for the past year and a half. The pain in my chest was unbearable. I pressed my hands against my ribs, as if they could prevent my soul from shattering. Shattering from the pain and fear that Dave must have experienced. He must have believed that I didn't love him, or, even worse, that I was planning to leave him. Why else would he go to such extremes to destroy me? "You're wrong, Dave," I screamed to the empty room. "I never loved you any less. It was just a physical connection with the others. I never intended to hurt you, and I would never have left you." I fell back onto the couch, devastated by one certainty. Dave died without knowing that. My mind drifted off into a state of daydreaming, a defense mechanism, I suppose. Chapter 3. Rita. "Are you in there?" It was my sister Mary's voice. The gravel hitting the open upstairs window and her shouts jolted me out of my hungover daze. I was still fully dressed and lying on the bed in the master bedroom. Stumbling to the window, I looked outside with bleary eyes, then made my way downstairs to let Mary in through the back door. She and her husband had been on a cruise for the past 10 days. As far as I knew, she had no idea about Dave's passing. "Rita, are you okay? I heard about Dave. You must be devastated. Why haven't you been answering your phone still half asleep?" The weight of my loss hit me again, and her questions overwhelmed me. Without saying a word, I let her in, walked over to where my phone was charging, and tried turning it on. Dead. I collapsed onto one of the kitchen chairs and burst into tears as the flood of memories returned. Mary sat down next to me and held my hands in hers. Oh my God. How could they leave you alone in this state? Wait, I'll call Anne. Why isn't she here? Just as she reached for her phone, I let out a loud no, stunning her into immobilization. She sat there as I gathered my strength and mentally prepared myself to lose my sister's respect, along with the respect of the entire world. Finally. Do you remember that time about 11 years ago when Dave was working for the coroner in the act, after that girl died in the demolition accident? Mary nodded. I had been proud at the time that my husband was considered skilled enough in his profession to be called upon as an assistant investigator. Dave was away for nearly 2 weeks. Well, this was harder than I thought. Mary was my younger sister and had always admired me. There was this young guy, Brian, who was on the same church committee as me. We had flirted a bit in the past. Mary frowned at me, but remained silent. Well, while Dave was in Canberra, I agreed to have dinner with Brian. He was in his late 20s and attractive, if you know what I mean. I had a few glasses of wine with dinner, and seeing the horror on Mary's face almost made me lose my nerve, but I took a deep breath and pushed forward. I found solace in the memories of that time. I was paying the price for my actions now, and although the logic was twisted, the memories of the excitement I had experienced in straying from my marriage vows were the counterbalance to that price. Oh, Mary. Brian was passionate and full of energy. He took me back to his place, and we were intimate over and over again. It was incredible. I had so many moments of incredible pleasure, Rita. Oh my God, stop. Are you here to confess or to brag about your affair? Her rebuke caused my face to flush with embarrassment. I apologized for getting sidetracked and continued with a relatively detached account of the night with Brian that lasted until the next day. Mary was shocked that I had betrayed Dave in a drunken mistake like that. But she was even more shocked when I revealed that I had gone back for more, repeatedly, once I had overcome my guilt. I only stopped when Brian was blinded in a tragic accident at the school where he taught chemistry. He was alone in the lab when a glass container he was heating exploded. The shards of glass and the corrosive liquid from the flask caused him to lose both of his eyes. He hadn't been wearing the proper protective gear. After that, I lost contact with him. Mary sat there in stunned silence throughout my confession. So, when did your secret relationship end? That relationship ended a little over 10 years ago. A heavy silence fell upon us, both of us unsure of how to continue the conversation. That relationship, yes. Oh, Mary, you wouldn't believe how it boosts a woman's confidence at our age to have someone else in her life. Someone young, attractive, and, energetic, if you catch my drift. I fell into an awkward silence, praying that Mary wouldn't press further on the topic that her expression hinted. And I assume by the smug look on your face that the satisfaction of deceiving Dave played a part too. I had always known my younger sister was perceptive. She proved it once again. I had often wondered if part of my desire to find a replacement for Brian, just a little over a year after his disfigurement, stemmed from my own feelings of inadequacy compared to my husband. I recalled that time vividly. Sure, I wasn't as successful in my career as Dave, but I was a fantastic parent. Then it hit me like a bolt of lightning. Dave was both an amazing parent and a successful professional. Deep down, I had always known that this likely influenced my actions. I don't know, maybe. I certainly didn't want to hurt him, but you decided to seek companionship elsewhere, didn't you? With a tinge of shame, I cast my gaze downward at the table. Yes, and this person was young and fit, right? My silence spoke volumes. Tell me everything. Well, Michael wasn't entirely my fault. Around that time, Dave began experiencing difficulties in the intimate department. I felt like I couldn't excite him anymore, no matter what I tried. I was still in my prime, and it hurt. Enough with the excuses, Rita. Get to the part about finding comfort in someone else's affection. It wasn't just about the intimacy, Mary, I protested. Michael was a nice guy. He was romantic and smart. We always had a great time. And you always ended up at his place staring at the ceiling while he made you feel good. Well, yes, and how long did Michael last? Until he got tired of being seen out with someone older than him. Until he wanted to settle down and have children with someone his own age. God, this was embarrassing. No. Michael passed away after about 5 or 6 months. Passed away. How? I never really found out. He invited me over for a barbecue. He was going to cook me one of the burgers he said he was famous for. Then, after spending some time together in the bedroom, he planned to take me out to meet some of his friends at a football match. I did what I normally did, parked at the shopping center about 2 blocks away, and walked to his place. As I approached his house, firefighters were everywhere, and the house was partly collapsed and fully on fire. I didn't have a choice, did I? I went home. Michael wasn't answering his phone, and in the paper the next day, it was reported that the homeowner was killed. I went back 2 days later and spoke to a neighbor. Apparently, everyone thought that Michael was trying to light the barbecue and the gas bottle exploded. Oh, Mary, it was horrible. Yes, I can imagine. Having a friend killed can be traumatic. Yes, that too. But it could have been me. If Michael had waited until I got there to start the barbecue, I could have been killed as well. Not only that, but the investigators were still there and the neighbor introduced me as someone Michael knew. They questioned me like the explosion wasn't a horrible accident. I convinced them I couldn't help. But I lived in fear for the next few months that they would discover more and somehow Dave would find out. Don't look at me like that, Mary. I know you think I'm a serial cheater and maybe even that I'm self-centered, but I only wanted to protect Dave and my family from the consequences. I fell silent, remembering the intense fear of that time, years ago. So, you went back to being a loyal wife and mother. After that, I debated with myself on whether to end my confession there, but I couldn't. The fact that I didn't know my husband as well as I thought I did, to the point that he successfully hid his knowledge of my affairs for who knows how many years, had deeply unsettled me. I was a person of faith but not a religious one. I couldn't seek solace from a confessional, and the thought of pouring out my secrets to a stranger was repulsive. For about 3 years, yes, Mary just looked at me, expressionless. Again, Mary, I don't think it was all my fault. Dave's difficulties got worse and worse. Oh, he tried, but he never fully succeeded, if you know what I mean, and that changed him. He continued to distance himself emotionally from me. It was horrible. I bought attractive lingerie, tried to spice things up, but nothing seemed to work. He began spending more time at work and even on weekends. He was still a great father, but being with me seemed to make him uncomfortable or something. Then there was all the pleasure I was missing out on, in the bedroom. It was like all the joy young, well-built men could offer me had control over me. So I went out and found a replacement for Michael. His name was Jerome. He looked like a real hunk. You know the type, muscles on top of muscles, fitness enthusiast, but I have to say, he was a little disappointing in bed. He had used performance-enhancing substances at one point, and I think that affected his performance. It only lasted 6 weeks or so, and I was planning to end it, but before I could, he disappeared. Yes, I went to his house one day and it was empty. Packed up and gone. Between you and me, it was a little hurtful. I thought he had genuine feelings for me and would at least have called to say goodbye, but no, he just left without a word. I haven't heard from him since. This time when I stopped, Mary raised an eyebrow, encouraging me to continue. I got together with Mario shortly after that. He was the best of them, in bed, I mean. He couldn't make love to a woman if he tried. He just took me whenever he wanted to. Oh, Mary, you wouldn't believe how good that made me feel. It was like being back in high school. Mary's renewed disapproval made me skip the details. Mario was a rebel, or at least he pretended to be. He claimed he hung out with tough guys in Melbourne. I thought he was exaggerating until. Anyway, he started becoming quite demanding. He said my insistence on meeting exclusively in private was limiting his social life and insisted we go out in public with his friends. I only went once, to a bar on the other side of town, but I spent the whole time there terrified that someone I knew would see me. Besides, he was starting to object to using protection. I didn't want to risk my health like that. I knew Mario was seeing other women besides me. I tried to end it after that, but I just couldn't. I had become addicted to the physical pleasure, I think. I called him a week or so later, and he must have missed me as much as I missed him because he agreed that I could come over to his place the following Friday. So how long did Mario make you feel amazing after that? Did you find out he wasn't lying after all? Let me guess. You showed up at his place on Friday, and all his friends were there waiting to surprise you. My disappointed expression seemed to soften Mary's sarcastic tone slightly. I remembered that time painfully. No, I never went to his place that Friday. His sister, whom I had grown close to, called me on Thursday night and asked if I had watched the news. I hadn't. Mario had been killed in a car bombing. It turns out he really was involved with dangerous people, and there was a turf war happening among local drug dealers. That shook me to the core. Again, it could have been me. Mary watched as tears streamed down my face. She didn't reach out to hug me. I didn't blame her. Even I didn't know if it was pity for my former lover or the remembered fear from that time 4.5 years ago. She allowed me to collect myself. Was he the last? Rita, now came the most difficult part to reveal. Now came the confession that my conscience hadn't had time to justify yet. Now Mary would learn that while my husband was receiving CPR on a golf course, I had been in bed in a rundown motel with my latest lover, happily engaging in intimate activities with my phone safely locked in my car at another shopping center parking lot. That's why I was one of the last to learn I was a widow. No, Mary. Unfortunately, Mario wasn't the last god. This was tough. I behaved for over 2 years this time. Then I met this new guy who joined the church committee, Justin. Not Justin Smith. Shoot. I had forgotten that Mary also served on some of the same committees with Justin. Somehow, the fact that she knew him made it so much worse. But he was married, with 2 young children. Shame made me miss the obvious clue I had just been given. I was trying to break it off with him. He was getting too attached. He started saying that we were destined to be together. He claimed he would leave his wife and everything. I was beginning to worry that he would tell Dave just to break us up. I had been lying awake the past couple nights, but fearing that he might have contacted Dave or sent him an email. Someone told me that shortly before Dave passed away, he received a phone call. What if that was Justin and it triggered his heart attack? I finally mustered the courage to look at Mary's face. All color had drained from it. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. I was confused. Finally. My God, you don't know. Do you know what? Justin is dead, Rita. He died the day before Dave. Someone sent a letter to his wife informing her of the affair, and she kicked him out of the house. He went straight to the garden shed and apparently set himself on fire with a 25-liter can of petrol he had stored there. I was shocked. I had been in mourning, isolated, for the first 4 days after Dave's passing, and I had been drunk since the reading of the will the day before yesterday. Or was it yesterday? Evidently, all the well-wishers who had visited this week didn't want to burden me with the local gossip. I looked at Mary's face again. If possible, it was even paler now, with hints of green. He knew, she whispered, shaking her head. All along he knew. Who knew what, Mary? Dave. Think about it. Can't you see the pattern? What pattern? What are you talking about? Mary looked at me impatiently. He knew, Rita. Dave knew about all of them. All of your friends. I shook my head, unable to speak. No, 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 screamed my internal voice. The pain of Dave knowing about all of my close relationships was too much. For every shake of my head, Mary nodded. Even in my stress, I was reminded of our childhood arguments. Those silly no, I didn't, yes, you did arguments that would continue until either Mom or Dad would tell us to be quiet. Yes, Rita, he knew about each and every one of them. Think about it. Your first friend, Brian, blinded when something exploded in the chem lab. Who was the next one? Michael, I whispered. That's right. Michael died when a gas bottle exploded the day you were going out with him to a public football match. That Jerome guy disappearing without a trace. Mario? Soon after you, and he started going out in public, kaboom. Died in a car bombing. Now Justin. He was possibly going to expose your secret, but no, again, kaboom, he's dead. Can't you see? You must. You can't be that blind at my silence, Mary scoffed. What did Dave do for a living, Rita? How hard would it be for a guy with his expertise in explosives and pyrotechnics to rig some targeted explosions while leaving no evidence? If anyone knew how to make any one of those explosions look like an accident, it was Dave. I was incapable of speech as the symmetry of all Mary was saying sank into my exhausted, hungover head. It all made ugly, horrifying sense. If I'm right, and I'm certain I am, Rita, Dave knew about your friendships all the way back to your first. He either faked his problems in the bedroom to avoid being intimate with your disloyal self or really did have trouble connecting with you. He kept an eye on you and your friends, and when there was a chance of your secret being publicly exposed, and thus him being forced to act, he took measures. But that can't be right. He would have confronted me, I offered lamely, still trying to cling to my delusion. What? And risk breaking up his family. You know better than me that family was the most important thing in his life. No, he would wait until Anne was out of the house before making a move like that. The pieces of the puzzle fit so well that I knew they were the truth, as disheartening as it was. The man I'd thought loved me completely was plotting to confront me in the very near future as soon as our nest was empty. It was the most devastating certainty I'd ever known. I was only vaguely aware of Mary standing. Her voice surprised me when she spoke from behind me, between me and the back door. I flinched. "I'm going now, Rita. I know you need me, but frankly, you disappoint me. I would never have believed this of you if I hadn't heard it from your own mouth. Besides, I have to cook Pete's dinner." With those condemning words, she left me as well. I have no memory of the following hours, as the next thing I remember, it was dark. Chapter 4. I was roused by quiet noises from the bathroom. Curious and a little afraid, I stood and walked in. Anne was there holding a clear plastic bag with Dave's hairbrush in it. "What the heck?" "Anne, honey, you scared me." "Why do you want that?" I asked, pointing to the brush. She glared at me with an angry expression. I took a step back. "Because, Mother, something Dad asked me to do years ago made sense to me today." I was really confused by her response and hurt by her facial expression. "What?" "When I was about 8, Dad took a DNA swab from me. Told me it was to check for any genetic weaknesses. I believed that at the time, but today it hit me. I think he wanted to check that I was his biological daughter. So do I now." Anne glared at me as the implications of this statement hit me between the eyes. Brian had been my first friend since I'd been married, but Dave didn't know that. By the time I'd recovered enough, I was too late. A glance out the window showed me Anne lugging 2 suitcases down the front path. She turned to walk along the street. I raced outside, but was just in time to see and hear my husband's old Mustang pulling out and away. I'd never felt so utterly alone in my entire life. I used logic to delay the overwhelming emotions I sensed circling, trying to find a way into my head and consume it. I went through what I could remember of Mary's logic, wanting desperately to believe Dave couldn't have known for 11 years. The only evidence to support my wish was my belief that he was too open and honest to hide his knowledge from me. The Dave I knew couldn't have pretended to love me that much. A vague memory came unbidden. The day before the reading of the will, I'd been going through Dave's closet to find a suit for the funeral home. I thought he had more clothes than that. Jumping from the couch, I raced upstairs to the master bedroom and flung his wardrobe open again. Sure enough, the remaining clothes were spread along the hangers to give the illusion of bulk. Dave was secretly moving his clothes out of our house. With a shock, I realized that when Anne finally left the nest, Dave would have followed right behind her. The one burning question searing my soul was, how long had he known Mary's words came back to me and fit into a neat, undeniable pattern? The answer was 11 years. With a dreadful certainty, I now accepted that Dave's intimacy issues weren't physical. He'd somehow found out about Brian and no longer wanted to connect with me. That was terrible. Dave had been, 49 at the time, to practically give up physical intimacy at that age. Just because your spouse wasn't strong enough to resist the allure of casual friendship with a young person. But 11 years, staying in a house, in a relationship with me. Why? The answer came to me instantly. It was exactly the man Dave was. In his eyes, he'd made a mistake in marrying me, but from that marriage, 3 lives had been created. 3 innocent lives. Dave would have felt they shouldn't suffer because of his bad judgment. They were his responsibility. Walking away from the marriage would have put the emotional well-being of his children at risk, and that is something he'd never do. At the time I met Brian, Molly would have been 19, Derek 17, but little Anne only 7. A cold shiver passed right through me. He'd intended to hang around until the nest was empty. Then, with his duty complete, where were his clothes? I can't explain the depth of my shame. And frustration. Yes, I said frustration. I'd taken extraordinary precautions to hide my relationships. Now, Mary's logic implied that he'd found out about Brian. Somehow the timing of him developing performance problems proved that. If he'd confronted me, the facade of a happy family would have been forever ruined. The children's welfare compromised. Unable to vent his anger on me, would he have lashed out at Brian? I couldn't reconcile the Dave I knew with someone capable of harming a fellow human being. Much easier to convince myself that Brian's fate was an unfortunate accident, as I'd always thought. Once it was known what I was capable of, it was exactly in Dave's nature to look for recurrences. What had he felt when he discovered Michael? Devastation is probably not a big enough word. My soul cringed at the thought of him tracking my movements and behavior, all the while maintaining his rigid facade for the rest of the world. Burying his disappointment in me and hoping I didn't do anything to out myself and reveal him as someone who was let down by their partner to the rest of the world forcing his hand. If Mary was right, and I instinctively knew she was, Dave was monitoring Michael, and I closely enough that he knew we were about to enter the relational stage where the chances of discovery were high. Dave acted to protect my reputation and thus, his family. But could he harm? I couldn't believe he would. Much more likely the gas bottle exploding was only supposed to harm, like Brian. The 3-year break after Michael must have been a blessing for Dave, but his continuing avoidance of intimacy with me proved he'd passed the point of forgiveness already. And then, again, the shock disappointment when his surveillance discovered Jerome. The loneliness of hearing, seeing, reading all the evidence of my betrayal and having no other soul he could unload to. With Jerome, I'd been pretty indiscreet. We'd done it in the office at the gym once, just before Jerome. Again, the pattern Mary had spotted immediately. How had I missed it? Dave ignoring the threat to his family, until the chances of discovery hit a landmark that only he knew. I wonder if Jerome's bones would be found one day, or he'd simply been made an offer he was smart enough to heed, disappear without a look backward, or how Dave's opinion of me must have sunk even lower when Mario appeared with what now seemed like unseemly haste. Was Dave present in the bar when I went out publicly with Mario for the first time? Did he sweat from the threat of my exposure? Was I not the only one fearfully scanning the bar for familiar faces? For lingering looks? If only Dave had known my resolve to never go out in public with Mario again, or never loosen my unshakable insistence on taking necessary precautions. That way I could have saved his soul the tarnish of harming for the second, or was it third time? The 3-year break between Mario and Justin must have been a relief for Dave. Did he have hopes he could get all the way to an empty nest in his escape without another casualty? Did he have someone by that time who could share the debate on whether Anne was old enough to be emotionally untarnished by him revealing my shame and breaking up with the family? Whatever. I knew Justin well enough to know he wouldn't have felt bad enough about the destruction of his family to harm himself the way they said he did. His agonizing last few seconds on Earth when he walked into his shed, and Dave's trap, did not bear thinking about. For once, I hoped and prayed there wasn't an afterlife. Dave deserved a long and happy one, but after the actions I'd forced on him. All the logic and theorizing made perfect sense after 3 big glasses of gin. What didn't quiet were my thoughts of Dave's loneliness throughout it all, and my frustration at the thought I'd never know what tipped him off in the first place. When did he see through my act? How exactly had he found out? And the worst, when was the first time he'd said, "I love you," and been lying? The gin bottle was empty when my shame finally morphed again. This time to a horribly bad conscience as I realized myself had been the one who harmed those men. Not Dave. Dave had merely been the instrument. If I had been strong enough to keep my emotions in check, or, at the very least, cautious enough to keep my relationships discreet, each and every one of my ex-lovers would be alive or whole today. Gutted, and with the gin finished, I reached for the bourbon. Chapter 5. I was still feeling a bit out of it 3 days later when Derek called me to remind me not to go to his father's funeral. I got the feeling he didn't really want to be the one to break it to me. After delivering the news in a cold manner, he abruptly ended the call. Despite feeling down, I went to the front step and collected the past 3 days' worth of newspapers. There it was, Dave Brown's funeral at 3 in the afternoon. Everyone was invited to the service, but the burial itself was private. I may or may not have been in the right state to drive, but I did so anyway. Not wanting to cause any trouble, I made sure to stay far away from the graveside and watched from a distance. I couldn't help but hope that Dave's spirit would be there and that I could apologize to him. Apologize and ask him how he found out about my involvement with Brian. A sweet and comforting drink kept me warm as I observed Jen, Dave's longtime personal assistant, playing the role of the grieving widow. It pained me to see my 3 children comforting her, which made me realize that they knew she meant more to Dave than just an assistant. Jen dramatically fell to her knees as the coffin was lowered. Derek helped her up and supported her. They were the last ones to leave the graveside. I shivered as I approached, ready to say my goodbyes. Just as I closed my eyes hoping to sense Dave's presence, I heard a loud scream behind me. I turned around to see Jen charging towards me with her hands like claws. I quickly backed away as Derek and Ann subdued her and led her away. Molly stayed behind to keep an eye on me. Molly was about to walk away without saying anything when I spoke up. What is she so upset about? She received a substantial sum from Dave's life insurance. Why are you using such harsh words? Her love and support kept my dad going in his last few years. Dad left us a letter. When he couldn't bear the strain of dealing with your actions any longer, she was the one there for him. I am grateful to her for keeping him company during his tough times. But why does she hate me? Are you really clueless, or are you just pretending? She blames you for taking away the man she loved. She only confessed her feelings to Dad a few years ago, but their relationship remained purely platonic until you started being promiscuous with that Justin guy. It took him a long time to become intimate with her. She believes it was because you had damaged his self-esteem and he had difficulties performing with her. It was only after he passed away that she found out he had bought some black market medication, and she is convinced it contributed to his heart attack. With that, Molly turned away and quickly caught up with the rest of her family. I considered chasing after her and telling her about my suspicions regarding her father's true character, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. I realized that I had caused everything that happened to Dave. I couldn't ruin his children's memories of him when it was all my fault. Much later, I thought about what Molly had revealed. Viagra, memories of my intimate encounters with different partners flooded my mind, as if they were playing on a movie screen inside my head. I realized that those memories would undoubtedly damage any husband's self-esteem. This just made everything worse. Not only did I destroy Dave's trust in me and force him to live a lie for 11 years, but I also left him with real issues in the bedroom, issues that contributed to his passing. My bottle of drink was empty, and I desperately needed to numb myself with alcohol. Chapter 6. The following 2 weeks flew by in a blur of busyness. I used whatever cash we had hidden around the house to buy alcohol and mainly relied on canned food from the pantry. When I bothered to check the mail, it was filled with urgent bills from different companies. One day, a bailiff knocked on the door to serve me with an eviction notice. I left a pleading message with Jack to see if he could help me stay. However, he never returned my call, and the eviction process seemed to continue. My calls to my children went unanswered. Was I truly that terrible of a mother that they would abandon me over a private matter between their father and me? Then it hit me just how significant my actions were and the impact they had on a good man. I felt lucky if my children ever spoke to me again. On the day of eviction, I was hungover and barely functioning. Some haughty man in an inexpensive suit acted like he was doing me a favor by allowing me to grab a few belongings. Eventually, I was escorted to my front step and informed that a taxi had been arranged to take me anywhere within an hour's drive. I remember standing there, feeling numb, until Jack approached me and handed me an envelope. His expression made it clear that he was not happy with its contents. I ripped open the envelope and found a legal document and a single typed page. The page explained that Dave had made arrangements for a small one-bedroom apartment for me and a modest allowance to prevent me from starving. Oh, Dave, a truly kind man until the end. The legal document was indeed a title deed. I dropped the documents on the ground and searched inside the envelope, hoping to find an explanation from my late husband. I wanted him to let out his frustration for my betrayal over 11 years. I wanted him to confess how he discovered my first affair with Brian. I wanted him to forgive me for my mistakes. But the envelope was empty. That's when the taxi arrived and honked its horn. I picked up the discarded documents and realized their significance. I understood what the lack of a letter meant. Dave didn't care enough to write me a letter. I was disposable and irrelevant. I didn't even think he made those provisions out of responsibility or duty. It seemed like he just wanted to ensure I survived to suffer longer. He wanted me to experience the loss of everything valuable and have the choice of giving up or attempting to rebuild my life. He wanted me to understand how I had ruined our marriage and destroyed the best man I ever knew. Epilogue few. Thank goodness my colleagues were able to put her in the police van. Now, if the rest of you could please wait outside on the patio while I have a conversation with Mr. Burrows, is that correct? Yes, while I talk to Mr. Burrows here, I will gather your statements later. Please refrain from discussing what happened amongst yourselves. Now, Mr. Burrows, do you not want me to call an ambulance for those scratches? No, I'll be fine, officer. So, Mr. Burrows, you're a medium. I prefer to be called a spiritualist. What's the difference? It's about a $20 difference, whatever it is. You claim to communicate with the deceased. No, not at all. I simply convince a group of gullible individuals that I can. I offer them reassurance that their loved ones are happy in the afterlife. In return, they pay me $60 per hour for my services. The spiritualist suddenly realized he had confessed to fraudulent activity and became visibly uncomfortable. The police officer was no stranger to situations like these. I don't think we will be pursuing that. If a group of naive people want to come to you and pay you for your so-called abilities, then so be it. So be it. So, what went wrong tonight? Well, Mrs. Brown, Rita, has been coming for a couple of weeks now. It usually takes that long for me to gather enough information about what they want to give them a convincing story. I discovered that she was recently widowed and was having trouble accepting her husband's passing, but honestly, tonight I was going to focus on Mrs. Gillespie. I had gathered enough information about her from Google to know what to say tonight. Anyway, we were all holding hands and I had done the eye-rolling act for them. Hits them right in the wallet, that one, when I mentioned that one of my regular spirit guides had shown up to help connect them to the other side. The trickster paused to touch the 2 long scratches on one side of his face. As soon as I mentioned the guide's name, Dave, Mrs. Brown just lost it. She started yelling at me to tell her how he found out and other stuff like that. I wanted this week to be all about Mrs. G, and I wasn't prepared to guess what Mrs. B was here for. So I said Dave was fading and another one of my spirit guides was coming through. Mrs. Brown went crazy. She grabbed me by the throat and demanded I forgive her. She said the guilt and the loneliness was killing her. When I stayed silent because I was stunned, quite frankly, she started attacking me with her hands. She scratched my face pretty badly, the wild woman. She smelled strongly of alcohol. Are you going to take any action against her? If you want to report the incident, and if the other participants support your story, I can proceed with pressing charges. Yes, we'll release her on bail probably by mid-morning tomorrow. If you come to the station on your way back from the emergency room, they will guide you through the process of applying for a restraining order.